If I might, I want to start with a very broad question, which is, for those people who haven't had the benefit of reading your work, and most particularly your fantastic new book, which is available later on this evening, the book is called The Idea of Justice, and this is very unfair to you, but I wonder whether you could tell us what is your idea of justice.
Well, the book is on the idea of justice. It's not my idea of justice. So let me just first say, it's something about the subject matter primarily, and then within that subject matter, it's an attempt to make clear as to how we might go. So what I try to argue that the dominant theories of justice today tend to think of the deliberations on justice being aimed at clarifying or arriving at a diagnosis of perfect justice, in particular, perfectly just institutions. And that it tends to do indirectly or indirectly by using a device that was generated in just pre-Enlightenment or just pre the main phase of Enlightenment, namely Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, the idea of a social contract. So the idea of justice has got intimately linked with a kind of perfect world, particular perfect institutions, that a social contract should aim at and achieve. And I think there are two problems with it. First of all, I think the belief that we would have an agreement on the nature of the perfect world is, I think, well, I think it's a mistake. It's not that we wouldn't agree on many things, but, some people could give ultimately, when there's a battle between, say, promoting liberty and promoting economic inequality, may go in one direction or the other. And it couldn't be said that the one position would be unreasonable and the other not. On the other hand, both these groups might agree on lots of things in the Enlightenment period itself, like Adam Smith and Mary Wollstonecraft and many others I can think of, would be Tom Paine, would agree that slavery was unjust. But that doesn't mean that they agreed necessarily on a perfectly just world. So I think it gets the question wrong. And particularly to think about only perfect institutions, assume that we are not really concerned ultimately with human lives. And institutions, fine, but you have to second guess the institutions. Did you get them right? Suppose you arrived at a contract thinking that these will work out right and it doesn't. So the ultimate test has to be, how is the world going? So in both these respects, I needed a departure, or I think the idea of justice needs a departure, and also by the very concentration on the social contract, which is conducted by citizens of a sovereign state. You limit your deliberations on justice within the confines of the citizenry of a state. And while that might have been the direction in which Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau did and might go, and later on in our time, Rawls and Ronald Dworkin, John Rawls, the greatest philosopher of our time, I think, greatest moral philosopher of our time, Ronald Dworkin, Robert Nosey, differing from each other, but each taking a social contract within a nation state to be the central exercise. In contrast, say somebody like Adam Smith was right from the beginning was concerned with the openness of the deliberation. You have to listen to voices not only from near, but also from very far. And so the third respect it differs is that it makes the idea of global justice an absolute nonsense, because you can't have a global sovereign state. And indeed, that point of view was put forward very powerfully by one of the great philosophers of our time, named Tom Nagel, arguing that the idea of global justice is a chimera. And given that, I think we need a departure, but that really means we ought to really drop the social contract. Social contract demands a unique resolution and a concentration on institutions. Behavior will fall in line, and concentration of the participation of members of a state. And the idea of justice is much broader than that. It's concerned with how to remove injustice, in which anyone from anywhere in the world could have their say. We could pay attention. We don't have to have a complete agreement on the nature of the perfectly just world. But if we agree that certain things are subjugation of women, Mary Wollstonecraft discussed, or slavery in that time, people dying of illnesses for which cure is known, medicine could be produced cheaply, but the delivery system doesn't work. To agree that it is a grave injustice doesn't require you to agree on a perfect view of a perfectly just state. So that is the territory of the idea of justice, and the rest of the book is to elaborate how we might go about it. So I think, having spoken, I know once I did a television interview, and the person who was training me, the producer, I think, called, you have to recognize that if you speak for more than 2 minutes, everyone switches off. So I had to ask him whether he was specifically thinking whether if I speak for more than 2 minutes, they switch off. Or he said, no, anyone, maybe someone 3 minutes. But I think I've done more than 2.
This is an RSA audience, and I can tell you they easily stretch to 4.
Oh my God.
You are, of course, most associated, and particularly in kind of contemporary political debate in this country, with the notion of the importance of capabilities. And a huge intellectual industry has grown up around this idea of capabilities. I'm interested in first of all, you, again, as far as you can do justice to your ideas in the short time, to introduce the idea of capabilities, but also to tell us whether you feel happy with the industry that has grown up around this idea.
Well, I think the idea, of course, is not originally mine. It can be traced, at least in some form, at least to Aristotle, and also to Adam Smith, particularly those two. And, you know, I played a role in, when I first gave a lecture called Equality or What in 1979, one of my Tanner lectures, and then did a book called Commodities and Capabilities. I was pointing out how you can't judge the progress of a society by looking at the cluster of commodities you're producing. You have to see what it is doing to human life. Just as I said a few minutes ago, you can't judge its success by looking at whether the institutions look fine. You have to see what impact it has on human lives. So then the question comes, if human lives are so central, how will you judge human lives? Now, one way of going about it is to look at whether people are rich or poor. Now, that's a subject which I think, you know, there's obviously richness is a pretty good thing in many ways, but you could be disabled and still quite rich, not do many things. There are all kinds of ways. You may be quite rich personally, live in an area infested with epidemics and crime and terrorism. So it depends. You want to know ultimately how our lives are going, and so not just richness. But what about happiness? That's the other thing. And from Bentham onwards, this has been a big thing. And there the concern is that you look at whether people are happy with their life or not. Well, that's a very deceptive indicator because of the fact that we often adjust to great adversities. But the fact that we are bearing cheerfully our adversities doesn't mean they have gone away. That is, when I spent about 10 or 15 years doing famine studies, I was very struck by the fact how easy it is to make these starving wretches very happy indeed, extraordinarily happy, single meal, some promise of a meal coming, and so on. But that doesn't mean that their deprivation has gone away. The happiness is a very deceptive indicator, as indeed I think the greatest of persons in the utility-based tradition, John Stuart Mill, recognized. I see from Richard Reeves's book that when John Stuart Mill was 15 years old, he was very tempted by straightforward happiness, no nonsense, utilitarianism. And I guess 15 is quite a good age to be a utilitarian. but then he changed his position on that and introduced all the complications we know. And my grumble about the revival of utility-based thinking, including by one of my closest friends, Richard Laird, is that it's so Benthamist rather than Millian in outlook. So I think that's what I'm going to do. So we have to look at freedoms in real life, and that's where, of course, Aristotle comes in, as do many other philosophers in different parts of the world. But if you're concerned with freedom, how do you judge freedom? Because there's freedom to do this, freedom to do that, etc. And given that, you will certainly have a kind of possibility of a space, as economists in their stilted way tend to think of, namely dimensions of it, you know, from being freedom not to be hungry, freedom to get medical care when you need it. Then more sophisticated one, freedom to be educated, more sophisticated, freedom to be higher educated. Adam Smith has a wonderful description as to why, in the theory of moral sentiment, as to the working classes, why they remain what they are. Because not only are they born in a disadvantaged position, go to bad school, but immediately join jobs which leave them no leisure to cultivate their mind. And actually, I was privileged to write an introduction to the Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiment, which was published in 1759, in the 250th year anniversary edition, produced by actually Penguin, but Penguin, New York. I don't think UK has published it yet. I didn't know. I think UK is far behind in this. So, but
perhaps we'll wait for 300th anniversary.
yeah, we're waiting for that. But and there I discuss how neglected this part of Smith's discussion is. So actually, what was he looking at? He was ultimately looking at how much freedom people have to conduct their lives, things that they have reason to value. Things that they value, the sentiment, raw sentiment culture come in, our first reaction, as he said, but then reason about sentiment, that ultimately the theory of moral sentiment is more a book on reasoning than about raw feeling, but they are linked, very closely linked. So capability is an attempt to develop that. I think it's a very important perspective. I mean, just to give an example why I thrill, you asked me if there's an industry why I thrill. Well, take poverty. I mean, there was a brilliant young woman, a German woman called Wibke Kuckles, who did a PhD in Cambridge, not long ago, like 5-6 years ago. And there she discussed British poverty. And taking the standard poverty measure on which all these poverty relief programs go, you look for lowness of income. Now, she said, take families of disabilities. If you, the average population, chances are that 18% of them would be below poverty line. If you take a family with one disabled or more disabled members, then their income being below the low income threshold rises from 18 to, say, 21%. I've forgotten the exact number, like 21.6 or something. But then again, even with that income, a disabled person can't do many things. Needs support from others, needs prosthesis, need care. If you bring in the cost of those things, which will not remove all their disadvantage, but to the extent it could be removed, it's removed, and add on those things to adjust the poverty line, what percentage do you find would be below poverty line? The answer was something like 48, I think. In the 40s, I've forgotten the exact number. So the bulk of it was actually came from the difference between income and capability. Unfortunately, Wibke Kuckles herself became very ill suddenly with cancer and died. The book was published just as she was dying. But I think it's the kind of, many of these studies have brought out why the idea of capability is important for poverty studies, for inequality studies, and generally for understanding of justice. And that's why I thrill at the subject. But it's not, you can't base a theory of justice only on capability, but it's a very important part, namely judging how people's lives are going.
Great. I want to ask you, we've got about kind of 10 minutes, you and I talking before we bring the audience in, but I want to take this opportunity, if it's not too cheeky, to refer to the RSA's new strapline, which is 21st Century Enlightenment, and some of the thinking that we've been doing around that. And we were looking at three core ideas from the Enlightenment: autonomy, freedom, universalism, or fairness, and the human ends of our acts, or progress, and looking at what those concepts mean to us. Let me start at the other end, which is with the idea of human ends of our acts, or progress. You've done some work, I know, looking at whether or not GDP is the best measure of progress. And I know that your general philosophical approach is to emphasize plurality of ideas of progress. I suppose the argument that I suggested was that we need to create more spaces for us to talk about what progress means, that we need a more diverse account of progress. I wonder if you think that's true, and whether the work you've been doing about redefining economic growth is part of that kind of project.
I haven't tried to redefine economic growth. I think economic growth has a well-defined meaning, namely the growth of GDP and so on. But I'm discussing the limitation of its reach. Right. And I think my original involvement on it came with my work on early on development, which made my close friend Mahbub-ul Haq, at last dead now, from Pakistan, who started the Human Development Report. Start that, and he insisted I drop everything and help him, which I did. Well, I didn't drop absolutely everything, but most things. But he was concerned to get one kind of index, which would be much better than GDP. And I went on telling him it's vulgar to look for one index. A, because people won't have that agreement. B, you won't get a numerical measure, which is complete, all numbers are completely ordered. That's how numbers are constructed. But our idea of how progress is going would continue to differ, and sometimes we wouldn't be quite sure. Is in the days when Singapore had lot of, on one side had elections, but it was thought that freedom of expression was limited, whereas Hong Kong was not self-governed, governed by Britain, but freedom of expression was almost unlimited. There was a question, could be asked, which is more freedom in terms of the liberty side, or the electoral democracy side? And I think you could give somewhat different answer depending on what you think. Obviously, you could agree that if you have both, it would be much better. So I think that kind of issue remains. Mahbub was not going to wait for that because he wanted to hit at GDP, and he thought there's no way of hitting it unless you get one index. And as he once told me, when I was saying it was very vulgar, he called me back and he said, Amartya, it's exactly right, vulgar, very vulgar. I want you to do an index for me which is exactly as vulgar as GDP, but which stands for something more than GDP. And that's what I tried to help him to do. But you see, by the time I was advising in this commission that Sarkozy had appointed, of course it was quite clear, first of all, the human development was concerned with developing countries, with Sarkozy's more focus was Europe, OECD perhaps. There is also the question that now there was a time for a more plural approach, because Mahbub had won the war, and I absolutely insisted every time, and indeed when the New York Times interviewed me and the magazine had an article, I think he mentioned it. I said there's only one condition I impose. You have to mention Mahbub-ul Haq somewhere. You can't begin just with the commission appointed by Sarkozy with Joe Stiglitz and me and Jean-Paul Fitoussi in it, and he did. But by that time, Mahbub had won the war. And so now what we had to do is to mention the sophistication. Now, the commission was diverse. I was originally asked to chair it, which I wasn't able to do. But I remain what very ambiguously called chair-advisor. And happily, Joe Stiglitz agreed to be chair, I guess. So, and he was a very good chair. And we agreed, after some discussion, that there's enough plurality of views. Joe's own position was much closer to mine on freedoms and capabilities, but there were happiness people there. Importantly, Kahneman was there, um, Alan Kruger was there. So we said, well, that's one way of doing it. There were some people working mostly at OECD who thought this is an occasion to improve the GDP because there's so many mistakes. As I think famously it was mentioned, I can't remember whether it's Pigou or Marshall, that since GDP only mentioned market transaction, if a guy, man in this case, who actually employs a cook who is female, ends up developing a romance and marrying her, then the GDP immediately falls because it's no longer a market transaction. So there are all kinds of ways it could be improved. So we thought we'll do those three things. So there is an approach about how to improve the GDP, and there is need for it, not as a measure of justice and well-being, but it is an important indicator. Also happiness, the fact that there are better ways of going about it than Lionel Robbins thought possible in the famous critique in the 1930s. So we celebrated that. We discussed freedom and capability, in which some of the really interesting work was presented in this commission report. We didn't take sides, because as a chair advisor of the commission, it was not my role to take a side. Am I neutral between the three? No, I'm not. But I do think that they have room, and indeed, if capability is to be important, then the capability to be happy has to be recognized to be a momentous capability. It cannot be the only capability we value, but on the other hand, and it cannot stand for everything else that we value. So we have to have that plurality and at the same time an approach. And the approach of assessment, in my judgment, is based on freedom, which is what you began with. And I think it's that way of looking at freedom, which I look at. But actually, Adam Smith, of course, is very much Enlightenment character. Even though, as it happened, the theory of justice has gone on from Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, all the way down to Rawls, Dworkin, Nozick, Gautier today. And that's on the other side. That's on institutions. So I'm trying to pursue an idea which is part of the Enlightenment idea. I'm a huge believer in the European Enlightenment, excellent, and it made a major difference. But for that, I don't have to stick to only one part of the Enlightenment, namely the social contract. It was a very rich tradition.
So two more questions from me before we open it up. Can we go to the notion of universalism, or fairness as it might more commonly be called? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'll speak up, sorry. So if we go to the idea of universalism, or fairness as we might commonly call it, justice, I guess, one of the arguments that I made in the lecture was that we need to attend more to the sentiment that drives universalist feeling. What is it that encourages us to feel empathy on a global scale? And I guess one of the challenges for us in the modern world is that we live in an increasingly interdependent world, which requires us to have a higher regard, almost instrumentally have a higher regard for other citizens, regardless of the moral argument for that. I'm interested in your reflections on how it is one encourages universalist, whatever the content of universalism, how it is one encourages universalist sentiment. What is the basis for that? I talked in my lecture about empathy, for example, as being at the core of that. But I'm interested in your views as what it is that leads us to feel that we want to extend the bounds of universalism.
You see, I think we have, in my last chapter of the book, I argue that even though I celebrate reasoning, and it's through reasoning that how audible am I? Not very audible. Yeah, if you said what, I would have worried even more. But how can I make myself more audible?
Just speaking more.
Speak up.
Look out! Look at the room and not me. I guess that's probably.
Okay, I ignore you for the moment then.
Ignore me. Feel free to ignore me.
Okay. I think what I've ended up by saying is that the kind of creatures we human beings are, able to sympathize with other people's pain, able to understand other people's humiliation, does influence the nature of the theory of justice we are going to get, even though that's not adequate. Ultimately, we need reasoning. Now, David Hume, who was ultimately more of a believer on sentiments in the way you're mentioning than Smith, because the line is hard to draw, but I think it is the case, was very concerned about that. And one of the points he made in a very interesting essay in 1730, about 30 years almost before Smith's book, it's an essay called On Justice, was that, you know, we could not take an interest in people of the world when we were confined to our own country. But now that we have global trade, he didn't use the word, but now that we have economic relations far away, there's no way we can ignore their claim, our concern with them. And he thought that exactly what you said. Once we know these guys, if we don't know these guys, it's quite one thing. But if we know these guys, and maybe doing transactions with them, then there's something quite unnatural not to think at all about how their lives are going. You can't end there. You need reasoning. And I think one of the things I try to do in the book is that the beginning of our thinking of justice is always with a sense of injustice, which is more a matter of an immediate perception. But then we have to supplement this by reasoning, criticality, and scrutiny. So I think the same thing applies to our global concerns. And the global concerns are, if Hume is emphasizing how our sentiment automatically responds when we know there are people who could have pain and pleasure, who could be humiliated and maltreated or not. Smith is not only emphasizing that, but also saying that then you have to ask the question, what would it look like to someone coming very far away? Would they look, our behavior is just or not? So that's the big turn that Smith makes in the theory of moral sentiment, which I think, as I argue in the book also, is a prime mover of that. Kant was actually already referring to it in his writings on geography before he turned to philosophy. And I think the Kantian ideas rather narrowly, somewhat narrowly boxed Smith, but it was, I think Smith, 1759, is the prime mover. And that is the way I think we do. We can take into account our sentiments about people we know we exist, about which we increasingly know more, and we can then ask the deliberative question as to what would the impartial spectator look like as a device of trying to be deliberately impartial, having convinced ourselves that justice has something to do with impartiality. So that's the respect in which the book has very strong Smithian roots.
Great. And then my final question is this. One of the criticisms of my lecture, or response to it, was that when I talked about enlightenment, I meant the Western capital E enlightenment that took place in the 18th century. And what about a reference to the Eastern idea of enlightenment, which has a very different kind of connotations? And I wonder whether you think there is any value in comparing and contrasting the Western and Eastern account of what enlightenment means, or is that just semantics?
Matthew, neither. It's not semantics, and there isn't ultimately much value in making that comparison, because that assumes a kind of uniqueness of each. That's the direction in which the clash of civilizations go. Preceding the clash of civilization is a classification, in fact, partitioning of world into civilization.
Well, let me make it more concrete then, because
I was going to make it concrete.
But we didn't, the three things, we didn't talk about freedom. And in my lecture, I argued that autonomy or freedom had to be a self-aware, socially embodied notion of autonomy, not the kind of individualistic account of freedom that we very often have, which seems to be closer to a kind of idea of autonomy which would come through an Eastern idea of enlightenment, reaching enlightenment through a process of self-reflection. Is that a touching point?
No.
No, okay, fine.
I think these contrasts have figured both in Western thinking and Eastern thinking. Between Aristotle and Plato, there's a huge gap between exactly these kinds of issues. There's a huge gap between Ashoka very much a believer in freedom, and Kautilya very much a believer in discipline. And the fact is that each of these cultures are very wide, and there is, first of all, to give European enlightenment its due, there's nothing in the world ever happened at that scale, and drawing as it actually did on a variety of thoughts that came from elsewhere too. I mean, enlightenment was very much based on the Renaissance, development thereof, coupled with industrial revolution and so on going on. The Renaissance was very much based on things coming from elsewhere, Chinese science and engineering, Indian and Arab mathematics, and so on. So there were global roots to European enlightenment. And one of the distinctions I draw in my book is between two concepts of justice in Sanskrit. There are about 30 words on justice, meaning justice in Sanskrit, but two of the principal ones is niti and nyaya. Niti is a kind of idea that it's really the perfect institutions and perfect rules of behavior rather than actual behavior on which justice, that's how we should define justice. What are the perfect institutions? What are the perfect rules of behavior? Niti. Nyaya's approach all the time was, no, you have to judge how are the lives of human beings going. And that gap is the gigantic gap, and that's the gap today between Rawls and me, and Dawkins and me, and between Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke and Smith. Kant is more complicated. And that those are Western. Niti and Nyaya distinction is Eastern. I think that was also one of the reasons why I have been so skeptical of the many civilization-based thinking of the world. It looks as if you're being fantastically open and global. But this is just closing your eyes to the richness of civilization. You're allowed to have one idea. The Indian idea of justice is that, and the Chinese idea happens to be this. And I think that just diminishes each of the civilizations, just as it would be like saying, what was the Greek idea of freedom? I can give you at least 20 different Greek ideas of freedom.